It is now my great privilege to introduce Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute, National University, Singapore, who has had an illustrious career formerly as Permanent Secretary of Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Singapore's Permanent Representative to the United Nations, and Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, among other previous roles. He is delivering a special keynote, Navigating the Nexus, Geopolitics and Climate Change in the 21st Century. Welcome, Professor Kishore. The stage is yours.
Good morning, everybody. You know, the Americans believe that you should start a speech with a joke. The Asians believe you should begin with an apology. And I'm going to begin with two apologies. The first apology is that I want to tell you straight away up front, especially after you've heard from two leading experts on climate change, that I'm not an expert on climate change. So please don't expect to get any kind of detailed knowledge about climate change from me. But I'm very glad that both Jessica and Ravi spelled out the big picture of what's happening there. And the second apology I have is that some of my remarks might make some of you feel uncomfortable. But I have to, in some ways, bring out some hard truths. Because if we are going to succeed in this battle against climate change, we have to deal with the single biggest force that is the obstacle to dealing with climate change, and that single biggest force is geopolitics. And I hope in my remarks today to explain how geopolitics is a big hindrance, and hopefully at the end make some suggestions of what we can do about it. But why is geopolitics a hindrance? Well, to start with, to sort of understand how geopolitics comes into play, we should all acknowledge that the big, in a sense, lesson from climate change is that the condition of humanity has changed dramatically. And how has it changed dramatically? Before, when we used to live in separate countries, and we still continue to live in separate countries, it was as though we were living in 193 separate boats, right? And that was the human condition. So, for example, if one boat got COVID, the other boats wouldn't catch COVID because we're all in different boats. But what climate change has told us is that the world has shrunk. All 8 billion of us no longer live in 193 separate boats. We live on 193 separate cabins on the same boat. Which is why when one cabin catches COVID, everybody gets COVID. And now if somebody gets Mpox, guess what? It also travels. So if we are all on the same boat, the logical thing for humanity to do is to say, hey, let's come together and deal with the common challenges to our boat, because if the boat sinks, our cabins will sink. Now, as you know, humanity is not coming together to deal with climate change or other such global challenges, which is why I believe that what we should do is call this boat the Titanic, because we can see clearly what's going to come if we fail to handle climate change, and yet we're going full speed ahead towards it without any kind of significant or major reduction in our emissions. And you saw various voices, including Jessica's and Ravi, saying how we're not meeting our goals. So why are we doing this? Why are we being so irrational and not coming together to deal with climate change? And the answer is geopolitics. How so? Well, I'll give you 3 examples of, in a sense, massively stupid actions that humanity is carrying out. Now, clearly, if you are on the Titanic and you're heading towards an iceberg, we should all come together and say, hey, how do we cooperate together to deal with this? Especially the 2 most powerful countries in the world, the United States and China. And we all know that you cannot handle climate change unless the 2 biggest powers, the 2 biggest emitters come together to deal with climate change. But are they coming together? They're not. Instead, they're arguing about who should have the bigger cabin on the boat. I mean, that's bizarre. You have a boat that is heading towards disaster. Instead of them coming together and say, hey, let's save the boat so we can save our cabins, they're saying no. The focus should be on who has the biggest cabin. Now you may think I'm being crazy in saying that. You know, both Jessica and Ravi highlighted that you got to raise $1 trillion in financing. And Ravi said we are $800 billion short. That's a lot of money, right? Hard to raise. But you know how we can raise $1 trillion quickly? Just say, with this $1 trillion, we can defeat China. And that's how you get $1 trillion for the Inflation Reduction Act. And the USTR, Catherine Tai, admitted publicly that the main driving force for the Inflation Reduction Act was not to help humanity fight climate change. It was to ensure that the United States won the competition against China. So you can see how geopolitics is a far more powerful driving force when it comes to global decision making than common sense and rationality in dealing with a common challenge. And sadly, very sadly, I predict that the priority of US and China in the next 10 years will not be climate change. It will be about who's going to be number 1 10 years from now. And that will drive the decision making. And to make matters worse, if that wasn't bad enough, we have this looming possibility that the United States may re-elect Donald Trump in November. Donald Trump sincerely believes that there's no such thing as climate change. What hope do you have in the world over the next 4 years of moving ahead if the leader of the world's most powerful country doesn't even believe in it? And what does Donald Trump believe to be the priority? Winning the battle against China. So you can see, therefore, why you have to follow geopolitics if you want to understand how to win this battle against climate change. But that's only one example of stupidity. There's another example of stupidity. If you are in a boat that is about to hit a disaster, as you know, the most important thing you need to do is to select the best possible captain for the boat. You look around at everybody on the boat, find the most dynamic, intelligent, committed person, and say, make him or her the captain of the boat. That would be plain common sense. And shockingly, Socrates warned 2,000 years ago that if any of us take a voyage, and if we don't choose the best captain, we are putting ourselves at peril. 2,000 years ago he said that. And you know what? After 2,000 years, humanity still cannot choose the best captain. Why not? Because if you're going to come together to cooperate, all 193 countries, there's only one place you can cooperate. It's in the multilateral institutions. United Nations, IMF, World Bank. These are the institutions. But guess what? To become the head of the IMF, 88% of the world's population doesn't qualify. To become the head of the World Bank, 88% of the World Bank doesn't qualify because it's preserved for citizens of either Europe or the United States. Now that may have made sense 50 years ago. The world has changed. The rest of the world has woken up. We need to change. It's impossible. Why? Geopolitics. Power. It's about who has the power is more important than who's the most competent. But if that's bad enough, I can tell you what happens in the United Nations is even more sad. And I say this as someone who was ambassador to the UN for over 10 years. I can assure you, I must say, I'm glad that we heard the voice of Antonio Guterres saying that we must come together, leaders must come together. But I can tell you in the process of selection of UN Secretary Generals, if you are dynamic, capable, driven, visionary, you're disqualified to become UN Secretary General. You must have one quality: you must be completely spineless. And you think I'm exaggerating, right? I can tell you that ever since Dag Hammarskjöld was a UN Secretary General and was so effective, the great powers, including United States and Soviet Union, at the height of the Cold War, they disagreed on everything except one thing: never again have a dynamic, visionary Secretary General of the UN. How can we hang on to that at a time when the world needs a dynamic, visionary leader to lead us through the greatest challenge facing humanity? Again, geopolitics interferes. And if you want a third example of stupidity, if I can read my notes in the dark. Who should make the most amount of sacrifices when it comes to dealing with climate change? Right? And the simple answer would be that you've got to find some kind of equitable formula. So those who have contributed the most to climate change should sacrifice more. And Ravi mentioned the current flows of greenhouse gas emissions, but he also mentioned there's a huge stock. Now the stock was put up by the industrialized countries through the Industrial Revolution. So clearly, if you want to allocate responsibility, it should be allocated on the basis that those who contributed more to the stock should also make bigger sacrifices. But as you know, if any of you have attended climate negotiations, that doesn't work. And indeed, you know that our first effort at dealing with climate change was the Kyoto Protocol. But it died. Why did it die? Because it put all the obligations on the countries that had put up the stock and zero obligations on China and India. And there was a revolt and it died. So you can see, therefore, allocating who should take more is what divides the discussions on climate change. And it's such a tragedy because you can actually work out a fair principle of making the division of labor. But if you try to suggest in any developed country, including the United States should do more, then you're toast. So this brings me to another difficult point that I was going to raise here, which is uncomfortable, painful point. What's the fundamental reason why leaders, especially leaders in the developed world, cannot ask their populations to make bigger sacrifices to deal with climate change? And the simple answer is democracy. Right? Leaders have to get elected. Most leaders in the world don't get elected when they tell the people, you will have to sacrifice more if you're going to succeed in fighting climate change. And what's even worse is that at a time when we should be calling on the citizens of the world to make sacrifices in one way or another to deal with climate change, the leading democracies are doing exactly the opposite. And I can tell you this, the level of deficits in public financing in the United States and Europe are amazing. The US national debt, I don't have the exact figures, gone up from 40% of GNP to 125% of GNP, right? And this is not even having to deal with climate change, right? And if you cannot exercise responsibility in managing your finances for your essential things, how can you exercise responsibility in managing your finances for fighting climate change? So it's going to become harder and harder in the developed societies to get the resources. Now, how you fix this problem, I am not quite sure, because it is now become a serious problem, including, by the way, in Europe, to get governments to agree to balance their budgets and deal with these fiscal issues. And if this carries on, if people feel the pain, you're going to get more and more populist governments being elected. It's actually quite shocking. In a society as liberal and as open as the Netherlands, the single most powerful politician is Geert Wilders from the far right. You saw what happened in the elections in France. You saw what happened in the elections in Germany. The far right is emerging. It's going to get stronger because people can feel that their lives are not getting better. And no one is giving them answers on how to make it better. So if populism takes over the most powerful democracies in the world, populists are not the people who are going to say, hey, let's make sacrifices to save planet Earth. So these are the sort of structural issues that stand in the way of humanity coming together. And unfortunately, it's going to get harder. So should I end on a very depressing note? Or should I try my very best to cheer Jessica up by injecting a note of hope? The note of hope that I have is that fortunately, and this is true certainly in the developed societies, where top-down initiatives are not coming, there are a lot of bottom-up initiatives, like the one we're seeing in this room today, right? And certainly, if you look at the figures, it's quite amazing how much the United States has managed to control its emissions. The United States record is admirable. Not from the top down, from bottom up. So perhaps what we need to do in this fight against climate change is to encourage more bottom-up initiatives and find ways and means whereby we mobilize the people on the ground and tell them, hey, let's make sacrifices and we can win the battle against climate change. And since they say the best way to promote sacrifices is to be an example yourself, I would say maybe Singapore can also think of innovative ideas for making sacrifices. And I'll just drop one. Because, and this I wrote about many years ago in a column in Singapore Straits Times. If there's one country in the world that is small enough to not need private car ownership, it's Singapore. Right? At least one person agrees with me in this room. And this I've written publicly. I mean, we have now reached a stage of technological development, especially with self-driving cars coming around the corner, that we can leave our homes, get a self-driving car, drop us at the MRT, drop us at the bus stop, drop us at our destination, and you don't need to have private car ownership in Singapore. But this cannot be imposed top-down. This has to come bottom-up from the people of Singapore. And sadly, the main obstacle to this is not rationality, but the car, unfortunately, in Singapore is a status symbol. So why you buy a Lamborghini to drive at 30 kilometers an hour? What's all that engine for? I mean, it's bizarre. It's a status symbol. I mean, I have seen, these incredible luxury cars, even now HDB car parks, right? It's a status symbol. So maybe we can at least start a bottom-up initiative and say, stop seeing your car as a status symbol. Your car is actually a bit of poison that is harming our fight against climate change. Find some other means, and you will still be as mobile as you were. So it can be done. Let's try to find novel bottom-up ideas. Thank you.